Good morning, nerds. It is I. Game balance is one of those tabletop RPG topics that people like to talk about a lot, especially when they feel that a particular system doesn't have any. But is it important? And if so, how much? Well, that's what we'll be talking about in this video. But before I give you my balanced view of this topic, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click. And those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. If we're going to discuss game balance, we first need to define what it actually is. In my opinion, game balance is all about configuring and adjusting a game's mechanics to achieve a desired level of fairness. This is usually achieved by altering the challenges, rewards, and win-loss chances and conditions upon which this game operates. For tabletop RPGs specifically, this is handled on 2 levels, the game designer level and the GM level. And it's most often handled through manipulation of dice mechanics, setting the stats and abilities of NPCs, and by controlling access to powerful equipment. Most of the time this comes down to combat, how easy or difficult combat should be, but as we'll see in this video, while there is certainly a big part of game balance in RPGs, it's not the only part. And finally, it's worth remembering that the importance of game balance is actually pretty subjective. Some groups are obsessed with it, some groups don't really care, and some actively despise the very concept. But of those first category of groups, those that do like game balance, why is that? The first reason I'm going to offer here is that an unbalanced game is offensive to the autistic mind. And believe me, I would know. I'm not just saying this to be pithy or to cast some insults at neurodivergent people. I'm saying this because it's true. Any perceived unfairness or imperfection in a game's mechanics, especially on the mechanical statistical level, really can feel unpleasant to a certain type of person. And even for those players and GMs who aren't terminally autistic, well, having your character's abilities be disproportionately weaker than everybody else's really sucks. A lot of this will come down to what options players choose for their characters. Most RPGs offer at least some customizability for player characters to better express how the character acts through the mechanics. But if there's world inequality between these various customization options, well, as a player you can find yourself in a rather unpleasant dilemma between going with what feels right for the character and going with what will actually let you do things in the game. If you manage to solve this problem though, then you get benefit number 3 of game balance. And that's that it makes those character option choices more meaningful and more enjoyable. But game balance doesn't just affect how the players think and act, it also affects the GM. A balanced game generally comes with the expectation that the GM will abide by that balance, and by natural extension that the GM will play fair. While they may get up to sadistic tricks now and then, there's still the expectation that they'll stick within the framework. This expectation manifests itself both through the way that players perceive their GMs, and also through the way that GMs perceive themselves. And so, by natural extension, a well-balanced game will have a strong impact on the culture of play. And finally, good game balance does serve as a check on the most extreme outcomes of RPG swinginess. Most tabletop RPGs use some sort of randomizer, be it dice, playing cards, or something else, to help decide whether characters succeed or fail. The more unbalanced a game, the more that a chain of random events can go in a completely extreme direction. Either extreme levels of success that destroy the stakes of a session, or extreme levels of failure that just derail a campaign. But just because there are arguments for game balance doesn't mean there aren't perfectly valid arguments against it. First and foremost, tabletop RPG game balance is metagaming. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that while I've never worked in security, I am fairly confident that most security chiefs don't set the size of their guard patrols based on what would provide a moderate but ultimately surmountable amount of challenge for a group of potential intruders. In fact, if anything, those security chiefs probably want the intruders to be a moderate but surmountable challenge for their guards. And so yes, the idea of a perfect mathematically balanced encounter is kind of immersion breaking when you think about it. And the act of thinking about it itself can be more effort than some people want to go to. Looking at a different side of game balance here, while some GMs confronted with wildly imbalanced options for their player characters to pick from will actually start house ruling things to make things more balanced, others will go, whatever, pick what you want, and live with the consequences. And the same goes for all other forms of balance. Especially if there's any fiddly mathematics that goes into it, some people just won't bother. But even for those groups that do put in the effort to try and actively balance a game, balancing things too much can make the mechanics incredibly bland, with very little room for unique flavour, be this among PCs or NPCs. D&D 4e gets particular flack online for all of the player characters having access to pretty much identical abilities with no meaningful differences. And while that did make 4e an incredibly balanced game, it also made it incredibly unpopular. Likewise, making NPCs just a series of numbers to represent stats and skills does make it very easy to balance them and to figure out how strong or weak they'll be. But if they don't have any unique abilities to make them feel distinct from other NPCs, they will just end up as random grunt number 73, no matter what name you give them. And speaking of combat and balanced games, well, it often ends up being a lot easier than it might otherwise be. As we'll see later on, the level around which most combats are balanced by modern RPG designers. And finally, this whole activity can be a bit Sisyphean. Most game balance systems, be it D&D 5e's challenge rating or any other system, end up being very imprecise and in some cases just plain wrong. A so-called daily encounter in high-level D&D can end up being resolved by the PCs in a round and a half just because of how badly it's been done. And even with all that, combat does not occur in perfectly square, perfectly empty 30 by 30 foot rooms where everybody starts with all their hit points and spell slots. In the end, the best you can hope for is an approximation, but if that approximation is even slightly off, then it can completely defeat its own purpose. Now, I've mentioned combat a lot so far in this video, and indeed, a lot of RPG discourse around game balance does revolve around combat. But combat is not the only area of tabletop RPGs that interact with game balance. And in fact, in modern RPGs, there's an interesting split that I've noticed, where combat balance is weighted so heavily in favour of the PCs that most fights end up being a cakewalk. But most individual skill checks are balanced so that an average skill character attempting an average difficulty task will have about a 50 to 60% chance of succeeding. In some games it's like 40, in some games it's 70, but you get the idea. What this means is that in some cases, using non-combat solutions to a problem is actually much harder than just hit pointing the enemies to death. And in fact, if non-combat resolution takes multiple rolls, say having to roll multiple persuasion checks to get past a group of guards, well, that can put your overall odds of success pretty close to zero. If you have to succeed on two 50% chance checks, well, your odds are 25%. 3, 12.5, 4, 6.25, you get the idea. The more rolls you make, especially if there's no room for failure, the harder it is to succeed. Meanwhile, in combat, everything has been perfectly laid out so that within 2 or 3 rounds, even if you miss the odd attack or two here or there, you will bring the NPCs down. Their defenses and HP are low enough to ensure that. Part of me wonders if this is a big reason why murder hobos can be so common. If killing your enemies to death is the easiest option, well, you'd be a damned idiot for doing anything other than killing your enemies to death. But speaking of whether you really do need balance or not, some games, and indeed some pre-built modules for some games, actively throw the concept of balance out of the window and make things as unfairly difficult as possible. Now, I was exposed to this very early on as a GM because my first ever campaign was Curse of Strahd. And when they were deciding on the number of monsters that should go into each combat and on the amount of damage that all of the traps should do, I can only assume that the designers took one look at what would be the maximum limit of reasonableness and added 1 or 2 or 10 to it. A quick spoiler warning here. But in the town of Valaki, there is a combat encounter that the PCs are expected to do at around level 5, maybe level 6, sometimes even level 4, where they have to fight 6 vampire spawn. Now, a vampire spawn is challenge rating 5, which roughly speaking means that one of them is enough to tie down a 4-person level 5 party. 6 of them is more than even a large group can handle, I would know. I ran a 5-player, 5th level group through this encounter twice. The first time they just barged straight in and tried fighting the vampires in their lair, and this resulted in 2 PCs dying and the rest running away. They then decided that they wanted a round 2. And so what they did is they enlisted the help of the local militia to give themselves some extra meat shields, and they set the coffin shop, where the vampire spawn were living, on fire to try and smoke out the vampire spawn. This did not go any better for them. like at all. First off, the amount of damage that they were able to do from the fire and smoke inhalation was less than the per round regeneration that all vampire spawn have. And while those extra town guard meat sacks were nice to have, they still weren't enough to turn the tide of battle, and even more player characters ended up dying. In the end, the way I dealt with that encounter and the massive bottleneck that it placed on the entire campaign was to just have Strahd burn down the entire town of Vallaki and disintegrate a few PCs while he was at it. That seemed to do the trick. That one bottleneck encounter aside, from my one campaign experience of making things unfairly difficult, players can handle it. They get used to it quickly enough. Yes, they'll end up spending a lot of time in character creation, but again, they'll get used to that as well. As long as there is some sense of progress and momentum in the campaign, the actual difficulty isn't too important. That being said though, there are some players and GMs who will vehemently disagree with me about PC death. I would know from my comment section in my PC death video. But what if game balance isn't the thing that matters? Are there other things that you can concentrate on? And the answer is spotlight time. Spotlight time is a concept that is either used in addition to or as a replacement for game balance, and it's the idea that what really matters in a tabletop RPG is that each player get a roughly equal amount of time and number of opportunities to do something fun and impactful in the session. Some people will go so far as to claim that as long as players get enough spotlight time, they won't care nearly as much about the fact that the guy sat next to them can do 2 or 3 times as much damage as they can. Now, I would say that as a GM, managing spotlight time is of paramount importance. Making sure that you regularly switch between players so that nobody gets bored, and making sure that when players do things, they get a chance to actually do something useful, is really make or break for your game. As nothing will kill player interest faster than either sitting around doing nothing or having the things that they do amount to nothing. However, I don't think that this accounts for all of the issues with game balance. I've been rambling about this topic for quite some time now, and believe it or not, I do have a reason. What's brought this topic to the forefront of my mind has been my recent experience playing Cyberpunk Red. We are now 28 sessions into this campaign, and the further we get in, the more the system's balance is giving me grief. Cyberpunk Red's core book has 4 levels of NPC power level, and you're meant to look at these to decide how many of each NPC type to include in a balanced combat encounter. Mooks are the lowest level, and you're expected to put 1 per PC. Lieutenants are the next up, 1 per 2 PCs, then mini-bosses, 1 per 3 PCs, and at the top of the pile are the bosses, at 1 per 4 PCs. Although bear in mind there is only 1 boss stat block in the core rulebook. Now, that is a static level of encounter balance. There is no easy or hard mode beyond what you add to the game yourself. An average Mook has about half the total stat points of a single player character, and the only NPCs that come close to PC's power levels in stats and skills are the mini-bosses and bosses. The idea that the designers seem to have had with this is that a party that had a mix of combat and non-combat focused characters could comfortably take on an average encounter without too much difficulty. Pretty soon after the game was released, the designers realized that some groups were actually making nothing but Munchkin PCs, and that these groups could absolutely demolish any balanced combat encounter that the rulebook suggested. And so they added rules for hardened mooks, lieutenants, and mini-bosses, these being slightly toughened versions of the various NPC stat blocks from the core rulebook with slightly higher stats, slightly better equipment. If you had characters with, say, a 15 or more for their attack rolls with their weapons, or very high dodge or martial arts or auto fire, or even just a whole bunch of solos, if you had a party that had nothing but those sorts of characters, well, now you had a slightly harder option to throw at them. But that's it. There's not really much further that you can go, at least based on rules as written. And this despite the fact that the designers claim there's meant to be at least a year's worth of progression that each character can go through. If you look at how long it takes to upgrade a role ability from level 4, where it starts out for a new character, up to level 10, the maximum, the amount of improvement points that it takes will take an average group about a year to amass. And since improvement points can also be spent on skills, to really max out a character will take a lot longer than a year. And yet there isn't really much that you can do, rules as written, to actually challenge a party that has been around for more than a year. And bear in mind, I'm not at that point yet. We've been playing for 9 months, but we've only had 28 sessions, and I'm already feeling the pinch. Now, to be fair, I haven't really used the hardened stats that much, simply because, again, I am mostly following rules as written, and for most of the time that I've been playing, the parties that I've had have not met the requirements for a hardened crew. And so I've ended up being very hesitant to push beyond what the book recommends, and combats in this campaign have up until recently been very easy. So how did this happen? How did I go from killing 18 PCs in my first campaign to accidentally coddling my players in my current one? Well, let's actually reflect back on the journey that I took to get to this point. My first campaign, as I said, was Curse of Strahd, which is meant to be unfairly difficult. And when I was running it, I had no difficulty being unfairly difficult with my players. Although, to be fair, sometimes I went to lengths that even I ended up regretting later on. But rather than this being a reflection of how evil of a GM I am deep down, I think that this was more a product of me doing what the book was telling me to. When it comes down to it, I actually am quite an obedient person, as long as it's a piece of paper telling me what to do and not a human being. And it's this by-the-book methodology that explains why, in my next campaign, Conan 2D20, I actually really struggled to really lay any amount of pain on the player characters. There were no deaths in the campaign, and I think across the entire campaign, I inflicted a total of 3 wounds on the players. Bearing in mind that to inflict a wound on PCs in Conan 2D20, you either need to do 5 or more damage with a single hit, or damage them when they're at 0 health. Vigor, as the game calls it. I got that opportunity about 3 times in the entire campaign. Once was friendly fire, and the other time was a major tactical screw-up that the PCs made, where they had the melee character far away from the combat, and the ranged character right up in the thick of things. Those are the only 2 occasions where I inflicted wounds, because the game was weighted to be so easy that I just struggled to do it. There is the mitigating factor that Conan 2D20 does have a Doom mechanic that lets the GM inflict extra negative effects on the PCs and bolsters the power of NPCs by spending points of Doom, and my players did everything they could to prevent me from getting Doom, and so my Doom pool was always pretty close to 0 at any given time. Not that me spending Doom ever did all that much. If I spent Doom to, say, give extra dice on an attack against a PC, there was a good chance that the PC would still parry the attack, and that the Doom would end up being completely wasted. That happened to be more times than I can count. Throughout this period, both when I was running Curse of Strahd and even with Conan 2D20, I was almost always pumping up the stats of NPCs, giving them extra health, extra skills, all of that stuff. And while in Conan 2D20 it wasn't enough, in future campaigns it actually was. Especially in the Cyberpunk Red West Marches games that I was running about 3 years ago, where although I never killed a PC, I certainly had a lot of them ending the sessions very close to 0. This all changed when I returned to D&D a year and a half ago at the start of my last campaign. I had been away from the system for over 2 years at this point, and while I knew that the challenge rating system weighted things to be far too easy, I couldn't remember by how much it weighted things to be too easy. Curse of Strahd probably could have told you the amount of NPCs that you needed for a balanced encounter above and beyond the challenge rating recommendations, but I'd forgotten all of that, and so I decided to be very conservative with encounter balance. Even if my players don't believe me. I generally stuck with a good mix of easy, medium, and hard encounters and only used anything beyond that for boss fights, and made up for the individual easiness of encounters by just piling in a lot of them, usually 3 to 4 combats a day. During this time, I formed an implicit contract with my players, or at least I felt that I formed an implicit contract with my players, that while I might be a bit tricksy and a bit sadistic here and there, I would stick to the core framework of the rules as written. That while I would use rules as written as a stick to beat my players into submission with, I would also use it as a stick to beat myself into submission with. And so I never actually felt very comfortable stepping outside the lines, at least not in any obvious way. And so now we come to the situation that I'm in now, where my players have had the equivalent of 6 months gaming to improve their characters, to get new, better equipment, to learn synergies to take advantage of various rules tricks, and to just improve their skills and roll abilities. To the point where, for the most part, combat had been a cakewalk for them. The only exceptions were for player characters who didn't have 8 reflexes, and for whom it was actually quite easy for me to hit, at least compared to everyone else. And one fight where I got the solo down to like 4 HP by just sustained fire over round after round after round. Over time I did get a bit sneaky. I added in an extra NPC here and there to a fight, increased skills by 1 or 2 here or there, but I was generally a lot more conservative than I had been the last time I ran Cyberpunk. And after a while, I got frustrated. But now we come to an interesting wrinkle in the Cyberpunk story. This is a story that some of you who watch my recent videos will know, but it bears repeating at least in brief. The last mission that the PCs had was to investigate why a bunch of sewer workers were disappearing from the sewers under the Reclaimer town where the PCs lived. Now, in doing so, this brought them into contact with a bunch of mutant rats, and also some mutant cockroaches, but mostly rats. The first few fights that they had with these rats went well. The third fight that they had, they got through, but at significant cost. One PC had a severed hand, and another was now dangerously close to 0 HP. But despite their predicament, the party solo still wanted to press forward and see what else was left in the sewer, just to do a quick run through to find all the remaining dead ends, at least from his perspective. And another PC, the now one-handed nomad, decided to follow along. The other two PCs just stayed behind in the sewers and didn't help out. This would come back to bite the party because the solo and the nomad stumbled themselves into the final boss encounter, an encounter that was meant for a full-size party. To try and stem the tide of rats that were now rushing towards them, the party solo threw an incendiary grenade that triggered a sewer gas explosion that brought the nomad to 2 HP. The largest of the rats, that was the size of a horse, lumbered over to the two of them and spewed out a bunch of poison gas that brought that nomad then down to 0 HP. And on her next turn, the nomad failed her death save and died. The solo then had to fight a nail-biting fighting withdrawal to make it back to the rest of the party and flee the sewer. Now, the thing about Cyberpunk Red is that it doesn't have any rules for mutant rats, which means that I had to make them. The way I did this was by taking a cheat NPC system that I learned from my time in that West Marches server, where you basically give each NPC 3 numbers. A base number that represents what their average stat is, a middle number that represents their skill at things that aren't their main forte, and a high number for their skills for the stuff they're the best at. I then added on some extra abilities, some of which were invented whole cloth, like radioactive auras that dealt 2 damage to anyone standing near those rats, and some that I borrowed from the Offline's Online DLCs, like swarm-type enemies being able to do a third attack on their turn if they hit with one of their attacks on their previous turn. My players found this ability very sus, and seemed to think I was screwing with them, but yes, this is an actual ability that is in the game. It's just in a part of the game's rules that we have never had reason to use. Now, I have absolutely no frame of reference for how this changed the difficulty of combat. First off, because I wasn't using normal NPC stat blocks, I was using cheat stat blocks for non-human NPCs, and second because the encounter where the PCs died was one that they went into at half strength. Of course someone was going to die when they only brought half the party with them. And so, as I think about what to do going forward, I'm kind of at an interesting crossroads. I don't want to keep the difficulty level of combat as it was before the rat mission, because it just wasn't achieving what I wanted from the game. On the other hand, if I start upping the difficulty right after a mission where the PC died, my players will justifiably think that I'm getting adversarial with them and laying the pain on above and beyond what is reasonably fair. Ultimately, I am going to try and increase the difficulty of combat in my Cyberpunk campaign, but I'm going to have to do it in steps. I do have some ideas for how to do this, but since my players watch these videos, I won't be explaining them here. I have started doing things here and there already. My players haven't seemed to notice much, but I have been adding 1 or 2 more NPCs to combats than the book says there should be. And again, I have upped their skills by 1 or 2 here or there. I will keep doing that for as long as I feel it is necessary for the PCs to get a reprieve, and then the fun will begin. The good news here is that I do have the benefit of time. The way I've structured this campaign, it should take about 2 years to finish, comprising 80 to 90 sessions. So I will have a lot of room to iterate and to actually escalate the power level of the enemies that the PCs are facing. But to draw this video to a close, encounter balance is not the end-all be-all of tabletop RPGs, simply because most RPGs don't do it that well. Encounter balancing systems are generally very imprecise, and sometimes make assumptions about the game that aren't true. As such, they should be treated more as guidelines than as actual rules. But I do think there is a place for encounter balance in tabletop RPGs, and for game balance in general. And that is that it gives you a good frame of reference for how tough NPCs, traps, social encounters are. When you don't have that, things can go very, very wrong. You see, I said that for the most part, my Cyberpunk Red adventures have been fairly easy in combat for my PCs. But that's only in combat. The third mission that I put them through had almost no combat, and it hinged on a negotiation with some nomads. Now, in an attempt to make those nomads as powerful as they realistically should be, I gave them some very high social skills. Unfortunately, none of my players had high social skills. I was expecting to have a Rocket Boy join the campaign, but he actually didn't do that until after the mission. So my players were screwed. And yeah, that is why you actually do need some level of balance. Without a good frame of reference for what my players could handle, I got things horribly, horribly wrong. And if you want to avoid getting things horribly wrong, well, even if some of these systems don't work very well, They are better than nothing. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. What was the most unbalanced encounter that you've ever thrown at your players? Or if you're a player, what's the most unbalanced encounter that has been thrown at you? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel, and oh god are we growing fast. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.